Alright, this week's challenge is a graphic that's been kind of floating around on the internet, and this is one that one of my atheist friends was showing off. And the title of the graphic is, How Was the World Created? Now there's 6 different headings that represent different accounts of how the world was created. Now 5 of those headings are different religions or different religious viewpoints, and the last one is titled Science. Okay, so the first heading is titled Judeo-Christian, and so this is obviously the Judeo-Christian account of how the world was created. And here's what it says. How the world came to be. God created the world in 6 days, beginning with the day and night, then the sky, the sea and the earth, and then the sun and the moon and the stars, and then the animals, and finally the first man, Adam, which he shaped in his image, and goes on to explain a little bit more details about the creation account in Genesis. And then here's the key point. At the bottom of it, it says, what's the evidence for this? And the answer this graphic gives is this. It just says so in Genesis. So then the next heading is the Hindu explanation or Hindu account of how the world came to be. And it says that several creation stories in which the universe is in a never-ending cycle of creation, destruction, and rebirth, and it goes on to give the Hindu account of how the world came to be. And then again at the bottom it says, what's the evidence for this? The answer? It just says so in the Vedas. And then of course it goes on to list 3 other worldviews or religions that give different creation accounts. It gives the Shinto account, the Chinese myth account, the Norse account, and in all of those it gives the account that each respective kind of religion gives for how the world came to be. And then at the bottom of each of those it says, evidence for that? It just says so in their religious text. Now the last heading is titled Science. And in this particular heading it gives an account of what is allegedly the scientific explanation of how the world came to be. It says that the universe was most likely created through some kind of Big Bang, approximately 13.5 billion years ago. The Earth itself is around 4.5 billion years old, having been born, and it just goes on to explain the creation of the world according to this allegedly scientific explanation. Now, the key point here then is where it gets to the part where it says, well, what's the evidence for this? Well, the evidence is, there's a ton of evidence for this. According to the scientific worldview, it says, look, there's radiometric dating, there's Hubble's law, there's observations of cosmic background radiation, there's primordial nucleosynthesis, there's distribution and morphology of galaxies, and so on and so forth, general relativity. It just goes on and on to explain what they believe to be evidence for this scientific account of how the world came to be. Now here's the point of this graphic. All the world religions have a creation account, an explanation of how the world came to be. And the evidence for each of those religions as to why that their account is true is simply the fact that their religious text says so. It's not based on evidence, it's not based on logical deduction, it's not based on testing, it's not based on observation, it's just because they adhere to an ancient text. That's it. The text says so, so therefore it must be true. Now by contrast, the heading of Science also gives an account for how the world came out to be, it was created, but the evidence for that is plentiful, right? I mean, there's evidence, there's testing, there's observation, there's all these scientific facts, so there's tons of evidence for the scientific account of how the world came to be. But let's face it, this graphic really isn't an attack on all the different religions of the world. I mean, it might be a little bit, but in reality this attack is primarily directed towards Christians, or Jews for that matter, who happen to believe in the biblical account of creation. How do I know this? Well, think about it. How many Hindus have you ran into that are running around trying to make a case for their creation account? How many advocates of the Shinto creation story have turned to you on the bus and tried to basically pitch their account of the creation story to you? Probably not many. So really what this graphic does is create this Bible versus science kind of debate, which is not only an inaccurate way of characterizing what the real debate is about, but notice what it does. It automatically puts the position of the person who advocates the Christian worldview or the Judeo-Christian worldview in a disadvantageous position. Why? Because it makes them sound like they're anti-science. And of course, if you're anti-science, then you're anti-reasonable or anti-logical or anti-evidence-based. You see, this whole debate is framed entirely wrong in this graphic. This isn't a Bible versus science debate. It's a Judeo-Christian worldview versus naturalism. It's not a debate of religion against science. It's a debate over competing worldviews. And science, as historically it's been understood, is not really a worldview. All it is simply a tool that helps you to gain information about the world around you. So to really expose what I believe to be the fundamental problem with this graphic, and others like it, is to point out that there are really two different definitions of the word science that are being used here and at other times that I think are helpful to understand. So the first definition of science is simply science as a methodology. And by this understanding of the term science, we're just talking about, testing, observation, field work, using a Bunsen burner or centrifuge, or doing the kinds of things that normally we think of when people are doing scientific work. And this is the most kind of common sense understanding of science. But this is not primarily the definition that's being used in that heading science when we look at this graphic. But there's a second definition for the word science that's really being used here, and that is science defined as a philosophy. And that specifically is the philosophy of naturalism. Now, naturalism is simply the view that nature is all there is. Only physical things kind of exist. There's no God, there's no soul, there's no angels. Only material, physical stuff exists in nature and in the world. Now, of course, this understanding of science is much more controversial, but this is the way that primarily the term science is being defined as in this particular graphic. That's why under the heading science, the description that they have of how the world came out to be is a purely naturalistic account. It's a purely physical account of how everything came about. So I would make it a priority in a conversation to try to expose and explain this hidden definition of science that's being used here quite subtly. Because the graphic is trying to make it sound like this is a debate over fairy tale religious beliefs versus the hard, cold scientific facts. Now, certainly the philosophy of naturalism does use scientific methodologies to make its case. That's that first definition of science. But what's primarily going on here in this particular graphic is they're arguing based on science as based on the second definition of science, which is the philosophy of naturalism. Now, I'm not the only one who points this out. In fact, even naturalists and committed atheists are willing to admit that this is what's going on. For example, Richard Lewontin, who is a Harvard geneticist, has written in the New York Review of Books that atheists have a commitment to naturalism. Now, he points out that that commitment to naturalism is a priori, which means they have committed to this naturalistic worldview before they even look at the evidence. This commitment to naturalism also forces them to create naturalistic explanations of everything, of how the world was created, of how human beings and all biological life was created. Everything has to be explained by simply naturalistic, materialistic, physical accounts. And that commitment to naturalism, Richard Lewontin says, is absolute. That means it's dogma. They are accepting it no matter what the evidence says. In fact, he goes on to explain that because they have this dogmatic belief in naturalism, that it forces them to accept certain explanations that make no scientific sense. And Lewontin's not the only person who points this out. In fact, another atheist, Mike LaRousse, who's a philosopher of science, again, well-known atheist, has also conceded that he came to accept evolution, which, by the way, is a purely naturalistic, physical, materialistic account of how humans evolved or humans came about. So Michael Ruse said, in fact, this is in a debate against a Christian, he conceded in that debate that he came to accept evolution as based primarily on unproven philosophical assumptions. And so I say this all to point out that this is really not a debate of Bible versus science, as so often everybody likes to paint it out to be. And so in reality, science is not really a worldview, unless you use the word science as a placeholder for philosophy of naturalism, which of course is not justified to do that because that's not the way most people understand it. But science is not a worldview in that sense. Science is simply a epistemological tool. It's a way that we come to know things. But it's not the only way that we can know things. But atheists or naturalists don't have exclusive rights to science. Buddhists can use science. Christians can use science, Hindus can use science, Jews can use science, anybody can use science. In fact, those hard, cold scientific facts that are listed under the heading science in that particular graphic can just as easily fit under the heading of Judeo-Christian in that graphic as well. Radiometric dating, Hubble's law, background radiation, the general theory of relativity, all these fit perfectly fine under the Judeo-Christian heading. All of that evidence simply makes the case that the Judeo-Christian account of creation, namely that the universe started from a singularity and then expanded outward, all that evidence makes the case that that biblical account of creation is actually consistent with known scientific facts. And so one might rhetorically ask the atheist to give an account for their claim and the evidence for their claims. For example, they say that the universe just popped into existence from absolutely nothing. What is the evidence for that? Well, atheists just say so. Or they make the claim that the physical and natural world is the only world that exists. What's the evidence for that? Well, atheists just say so. Or they make the claim that the Big Bang kind of belched into existence all these cosmic constants that are perfectly balanced on a razor's edge, like the gravitational force or the laws of gravity, or you go on to all these dozens and dozens of cosmic constants that are perfectly aligned to allow for the emergence and survival of human beings. And this just all happened by coincidence. And their evidence for that? Well, atheists just say so. So you see, science isn't just a tool for the atheist. It's a tool for any truth seeker. But atheists aren't just playing with scientific facts. They're up to their eyeballs in philosophy as well.